Hello everyone and welcome back to Little Miss Reading Time Week. Today we have 3 new books that we're going to show you. We got Little Miss Brainy, Miss Somersault, and Miss Tiny. So our first book we're going to read is Little Miss Somersault. Little Miss Somersault is the sort of person who just doesn't go out for a walk. Oh no, not Little Miss Somersault. She's too full of energy for that. Rather than walking everywhere, she cartwheels everywhere. She doesn't walk through her front door. That would be too easy. She built a house where she could climb over the roof first. Little Miss Somersault doesn't sit in a chair. She just balances on the back of it. Look at this. She's this is how she makes herself lunch. She just puts the sandwich on her foot and the cup of tea on her hand, and it's just pouring the teapot right there. Little Miss Somersault doesn't walk around things. She jumps right over them. Yeah, she's good, man. And rather than answering the telephone as you or might, just look at her. Yeah, look at her. She's like standing like that. The other day, when she was cartwheeling past Mr. Worry's house, he called out to her, "There's a leak on my roof. Please, can you get it out for me?" he asked. Mr. Worry had spent the whole morning worrying that the leak might make his roof fall in. "I have a long ladder," he added. Little Miss Somersault said, "I don't need a ladder." And, as quick as a flash, she climbed on the top of Mr. Worry's house and got out the leaf off. A little further down the lane, Little Miss Somersault came to Mr. Skinny's house. Mr. Skinny was at the top of a ladder painting his roof. Unfortunately, Mr. Bump came round the corner and walked under the ladder. Or rather, he tried to walk under the ladder, but being Mr. Bump, he walked straight into it. Bump! And you can see what happened. Yeah, Mr. Skinny dropped, the ladder came tumbling down, and the paint and the paintbrush is falling. He's stuck on the roof. Little Miss Somersault had seen it all happen, and, without a thought for the ladder lying on the ground, she climbed to the top of Mr. Skinny's house and carried him safely to the ground under her arm. He wasn't very heavy. Man, she's strong, man. By the next morning, everybody had heard about Little Miss Somersault's daring deeds. The telephone rang. It was Mr. Snooty. "There's an umbrella stuck in my chimney. I hear that you're good on climbing onto roofs. I expect you to be here in 5 minutes." Mr. Snooty's house is one of the biggest houses you have ever seen. To climb the top of Mr. Snooty's house would be a real challenge, said Miss Somersault. It took no time at all for Little Miss Somersault to climb onto Mr. Snooty's roof. "That was easy," she said as she bounced on the chimney pot. Then she looked to the ground, far below her. That was the last thing she should have done. Little Miss Somersault suddenly felt dizzy. Her knees began to tremble. Everything began to spin round and round. Little Miss Somersault had discovered she was afraid of heights. Luckily, Mr. Tickle had to be passing. He stretched out one of his extraordinary long arms. Do you think he wanted to tickle Little Miss Somersault? Of course he did. But before he had brought her back safely down to the ground, "Stop it!" laughed Little Miss Somersault. "I promise I won't do anything so foolish again." And off went Mr. Tickle to look for somebody else to tickle. That evening, Little Miss Somersault was sitting. That's right, sitting in her armchair. Suddenly, the telephone rang. "My hat has blown off," said another voice at the other end, "and it landed on the roof of my house. Could you?" Little Miss Somersault's face turned pale. "Who is this?" she asked in a trembling voice. "It's Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. Little Miss Somersault breathed a huge sigh of relief. "I'll be there in 5 minutes," she said, and off she somersaulted. The end. Man, Little Miss Somersault is the long-legged person I've seen in my life. Now next we're going to read Little Miss Tiny. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small, not very tall at all. She was so very tiny she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole in the dining room of Home Farm. She had made the mouse hole quite comfortable. Really, and luckily there weren't any mice because the farm cat had chased them all away. The trouble was, because she was so tiny, nobody knew she lived there. Nobody had noticed her, not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived, all alone, with nobody to talk to. She was very lonely and sad. Oh dear. One day she was feeling so lonely, she decided to be very brave and go out for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came. She crept across the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hall. To Little Miss Tiny, the hall looked as big as a field. As she scuttled across it through the back of the Door Farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox who at the bottom at the door, she squeezed herself into it and in the doorstep. All of it was very exciting. There, before her, was a farmyard. She went exploring. She came to a door with the gap at the bottom and ducked underneath. There, inside, was a pig, a large pig. And, as if you are small as Little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Little Miss Tiny looked at the pig. The pig looked at Little Miss Tiny. Oink! He grunted and moved closer to inspect the little person who has entered the sty. "Oh my goodness me!" squeaked Little Miss Tiny in alarm and shot out of the pigsty as fast as her ever little legs would carry her, which she wasn't very fast because her legs were so little. She ran right round the back to the pigsty before she stopped. She leaned against the wall and put her hands over her eyes and tried to get her breath back. Suddenly she heard a noise, a very close noise. A sort of breathing noise. Very close indeed. Oh! She hardly dared to take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did, she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was there, right in front of her, looking at her with green eyes? Ginger, the farm cat. Poor Little Miss Tiny. Ginger grinned, showing his teeth. Shrieked Little Miss Tiny at the top of her voice. "Oh, somebody help!" The trouble was, the top of Little Miss Tiny's voice was not a very loud place. Ginger grinned, another grin. Every day, Mr. Strong went home to the farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs, lots of them. That day, he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again. Round the corner. He looked round the corner and saw Ginger and the poor trapped Little Miss Tiny. "Shoo!" said Mr. Strong to Ginger and picked up Little Miss Tiny very gently. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?" I'm Little Miss Tiny." "You are, aren't you?" smiled Mr. Strong. "Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't go wandering around in large farmyards." "But," said Little Miss Tiny, and told Mr. Strong about how she was so lonely she had to come out and find someone to talk to. "Oh dear," said Mr. Strong. "Well now, let's see if we can't find you some friends to talk to." And now, every week, Mr. Strong collects Little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see her friends. 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she just couldn't stop laughing all day. 2 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favorite meal. But that's much too tiny for little me, she laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. For you, he said, divide by 100. Last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly showed her how to stand on your head. That's very silly, giggled little Miss Tiny. Thank you, replied Mr. Silly modestly. And guess who she met this week? Someone who became a special little friend. I never thought I'd ever met anybody smaller than myself, laughed Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled. You'll wait until I grow up, she said. The end. Man, Little Miss Tiny is a tiny one. Now the last one I'm going to read is Little Miss Brainy. Little Miss Brainy was very brainy. She knew an awful lot of things. She knew simple things such as if you want a good night's sleep, you had to go to bed. And if you want to get up, then first you had to wake up. Yeah, that's true. She knew that if you don't want to be hungry, you had to eat. Little Miss Brainy also knew lots of clever things. She knew that it is quite impossible for centipedes to find matching colored shoes for all their feet. Now, Little Miss Brainy knew so much that people got to hear about. They came from far and wide to ask her questions. Mr. Messy came to see her. What can I do to keep myself messy? He asked. I know, cried little Miss Brainy. Don't wash. Mr. Messy was delighted. As Mr. Messy was leaving, Mr. Dizzy arrived. Is there anything heavier than a hippopotamus? Asked Mr. Disney. I know, said little Miss Brainy. 2 hippopotamuses. Is that so? said Mr. Disney. I'll go and check. Mr. Clever arrived. What color's my green hat? He asked. I know, sighed little Miss Brainy, nodding her head. It's green, of course. Oh, you know so many clever things, exclaimed Mr. Clever. Mr. Clever left, and so did little Miss Brainy. She had quite enough of listening to such simple questions. So she traveled to a place called Cleverland, where she hoped that everybody would ask her some difficult questions for a change. When she got there, she stopped in front of a tree. There was a pig sitting on one of its branches. However, I want to get down from there, wailed the pig. I know, said little Miss Brainy. You can jump down. How's he going to jump down? Good idea, said the pig, and being a Cleverland pig, he jumped right on the top of little Miss Brainy. You're not as soft as a pillow, he complained, and trotted off. Further down the road, little Miss Brainy met an elephant. He had tied a knot in his trunk. Please help me. How could I do this in my trunk? He asked in a funny sort of way. I know, said little Miss Brainy. I'll undo it for you. And she did. Phew, gasped the elephant. And blew little Miss Brainy high into the air. I feel much better now, said the elephant. I don't, moaned little Miss Brainy and rubbed her head. The elephant had blown her for some distance away, and she landed in front of a lion. I'm starving, growled the lion. What can I eat? Little Miss Brainy looked around, but she seen nothing and said quickly, I don't know. And she ran home before the lion realized that she was the only thing to eat for miles around. The end. Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more Little Miss books.